Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snow crunched beneath Mark's boots as he trudged up the narrow path. His breath rose in plumes, vanishing into the cold, dark air. The only sound was the occasional snap of a branch underfoot and the rhythmic creak of the sled he dragged behind him, laden with camping gear. The forest stretched endlessly around him, its towering pine trees cloaked in white, their branches heavy with snow. "This is it," Mark said aloud, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. Behind him, Sarah adjusted her backpack and glanced around nervously. "Are you sure this is a good idea? Winter camping? Alone in the middle of nowhere?" Mark grinned, though his expression was hidden by the scarf. "Relax, Sarah. It's going to be fun. Fresh air, no cell service, and a real break from everything. Plus, you said you wanted an adventure, right?" Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes darted to the shadows stretching between the trees. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in shades of deep blue and gray. A cold wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a sound she couldn't quite place, something faint, almost like distant laughter. They reached a small clearing and began setting up camp. The spot was perfect, flat ground, a view of the frozen lake just beyond the tree line, and enough space to build a fire. Mark worked quickly, pitching the tent and gathering firewood, while Sarah laid out their supplies. The cold seeped through their gloves and boots, biting at their fingers and toes, but they pushed on. As night fell, the forest grew eerily silent. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Mark stoked the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the sky, and they sat close, sipping hot chocolate from thermoses. "This isn't so bad, right?" Mark asked, nudging Sarah. She managed a small smile. "I guess not, but it's quiet. Too quiet." "That's the point," Mark said, stretching his legs. "No distractions. Just us and nature." But as the fire crackled, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every so often she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, shadows flickering just beyond the firelight. She told herself it was just the wind stirring the branches or her imagination playing tricks on her. Still, the unease gnawed at her. It wasn't until they crawled into the tent that the real unease set in. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful cry. Sarah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, the snapping of branches, the rustle of leaves, and something else, faint but distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling their tent. "Mark," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Do you hear that?" Mark groaned, half asleep. "It's just the wind, Sarah. Go back to sleep." But Sarah couldn't. She clutched the sleeping bag tighter around her, heart pounding as the sound grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It was too measured, too human. And then it stopped, right outside the tent. "Mark," she hissed again, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there." Mark sat up, annoyed. "Fine, I'll check, but I'm telling you, it's probably nothing." He unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, revealing only snow-covered ground and swaying branches. "See?" "No one's." A low, guttural noise interrupted him. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either. "What the hell was that?" Mark muttered, stepping out of the tent. He scanned the area with his flashlight, and his breath visible in the frigid air. "Mark, don't," Sarah pleaded. "Just come back inside." But Mark didn't listen. He took a few steps toward the trees, the light trembling in his hand. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the forest. It was followed by another noise. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched, and childlike. "Is someone out there?" Mark called, his voice faltering. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was small, barely the size of a child, and cloaked in what looked like tattered rags. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. It tilted its head as if studying Mark, and then it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that revealed rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Mark froze, the flashlight slipping from his hand. "Get back here!" Sarah screamed from the tent. The creature took a step closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. It raised a bony hand and pointed at Mark, its grin widening. Then, without warning, it let out a piercing shriek that reverberated through the forest. Mark stumbled backward, scrambling for the tent. He barely made it inside before the shriek stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, crunching through the snow. "What is it? What's out there?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. I don't know," Mark stammered. "We need to get out of here. Now." They threw on their boots and jackets, grabbing only the essentials before bursting out of the tent. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing bathed in darkness. All around them, shadows moved, figures darting between the trees, their glowing eyes watching. Mark and Sarah ran, their breath ragged and their footsteps uneven on the icy ground. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and bending, as if alive. The laughter followed them, growing louder, mingling with whispers and faint, ghostly voices. "Over here!" Mark shouted, spotting the lake ahead. "We can cross the ice! It's faster!" Sarah hesitated but followed, her boots slipping on the frozen surface. The lake stretched out before them, a vast, icy expanse under the pale light of the moon. But as they ran, the ice began to groan and crack beneath their weight. "Keep going," Mark urged. They were halfway across when Sarah heard it again. The laughter. But this time it was closer. She turned and her heart stopped. The figures were on the ice now, gliding toward them effortlessly, their movements silent and fluid. The childlike creature was at the front, its jagged grin never faltering. "Mark!" Sarah screamed. Mark turned just in time to see the creature reach out, its bony fingers brushing against Sarah's arm. She stumbled, falling hard onto the ice. The creature loomed over her, its eyes glowing brighter. Mark lunged forward, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her to her feet. Together they ran, the ice cracking and splintering beneath them. The shore was just ahead with the creatures, closing in from all sides. And then, without warning, the ice gave way. Mark and Sarah plunged into the freezing water, the shock stealing the breath from their lungs. They clawed at the edges of the ice, struggling to pull themselves out, but the creatures were there, their skeletal hands reaching into the water. Mark felt something wrap around his ankle, pulling him down. He kicked desperately, his lungs burning, his vision blurring. Beside him, Sarah screamed, her voice muffled by the water. And then everything went silent. When Mark opened his eyes, he was lying on the snow-covered ground, the forest eerily quiet once more. The lake was calm, its surface unbroken. He sat up, shivering, his breath coming in gasps. "Sarah?" he called, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. "Sarah!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. He ran to the edge of the lake, scanning the surface for any sign of her, but she was gone. The only evidence of their struggle was the shattered ice and the faint echo of laughter, fading into the distance. Mark never found Sarah. When search teams arrived days later, they discovered his campsite abandoned, the tent ripped to shreds, and strange tracks in the snow. Mark was found wandering the forest, incoherent and frostbitten, mumbling about glowing eyes and laughter. To this day, he refuses to speak of what happened. But locals warn against camping by the lake in winter, whispering of restless spirits that haunt the frozen wilderness, waiting for their next victims.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it a chill that seemed to bite straight through layers of down jackets and woolen thermals. David adjusted the straps of his heavy backpack and glanced back at his companions, Sarah and Eric. They were trudging along the narrow, snow-covered trail, their breaths visible in the icy air. The three friends had planned this winter camping trip for months, envisioning crisp, serene landscapes untouched by other campers. But now, with the sun setting and shadows stretching long and thin across the frozen terrain, David was beginning to regret his enthusiasm. "We're almost there," Eric said, his voice muffled through his scarf. He pulled out a GPS device and squinted at the screen. "Another half-mile to the spot I marked." Sarah gave a weak thumbs up, her face pale from exhaustion. She hadn't complained once, but David could see she was struggling. They'd been hiking for hours, and the isolation was starting to feel oppressive. As they pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around them. The towering pines blocked out what little light remained, and an unsettling silence settled over the group, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow. Finally, they arrived at a small clearing. Eric pointed to a spot sheltered by a large rock formation. "Perfect. Let's set up here." The trio worked quickly, pitching their tents and gathering wood for a fire. The flames soon crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. They huddled around the fire, eating instant noodles and sipping hot cocoa from thermoses. The warmth was a welcome relief, but the oppressive silence of the forest lingered. You know, Eric said, breaking the quiet, this area has a bit of a reputation. David raised an eyebrow. What kind of reputation? Eric smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. There's a legend about a trapper who lived out here in the 1800s. They say he went mad one winter after getting snowed in. He started hearing voices in the woods, whispers calling his name. When the snow finally melted and a search party came, they found his cabin empty. No sign of him, just bloodstains on the floor and claw marks on the walls. Sarah shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. Why would you tell that story now? We're literally in the middle of nowhere. Eric shrugged, his grin unfazed. Just thought it was interesting. Adds a little atmosphere. David rolled his eyes. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm sure we'll all sleep great tonight. The fire eventually died down and they retreated to their tents. The forest was pitch black now, the kind of darkness that made you question if your eyes were even open. David zipped up his sleeping bag and tried to get comfortable, but sleep wouldn't come. The temperature had dropped sharply and the wind outside sounded almost like voices. He shook his head, telling himself it was just Eric's story playing tricks on him. Sometime later, David jolted awake. He wasn't sure what had roused him, but something felt off. He listened intently, the silence now deafening. Then, faintly, he heard it. A low, rhythmic sound like someone crunching through the snow. His heart began to race. Eric? He whispered. Sarah? No response. The sound grew louder, circling the campsite. David fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling. When he turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the inside of his tent. Nothing seemed amiss, but the noise outside persisted. He considered calling out again, but decided against it. If it was an animal, he didn't want to draw attention. The footsteps stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. David held his breath, straining to hear anything. Just as he began to relax, his tent zipper moved. It wasn't fast or frantic, but slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was testing it. David's blood ran cold. He clutched the flashlight tighter, pointing it at the zipper. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The zipper stopped. For a moment there was nothing. Then the tent walls began to bulge inward, as though invisible hands were pressing against them. David scrambled backward, his flashlight shaking in his grip. He shouted for Eric and Sarah, but his voice was drowned out by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the trees. And then it was gone. The bulging stopped, the wind died down, and the night was silent once more. David sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to check on his friends, but was too afraid to leave the tent. After what felt like hours, exhaustion finally overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. When he woke the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the campsite. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. Eric and Sarah were already up, their expressions grim. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" David asked, his voice hoarse. Eric nodded. "Yeah, I thought I heard footsteps, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there." Sarah pointed to the snow. "Look." David followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Tracks circled their campsite, but they weren't human. They were long and narrow, almost claw-like, and they seemed to appear out of nowhere, with no sign of where they started or ended. "Maybe it was some kind of animal," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. David shook his head. "An animal that unzips tents? I don't think so." They packed up quickly, their earlier excitement replaced by a tense urgency. As they hiked back toward the trailhead, the forest seemed even darker and more foreboding than before. Every rustle of branches or crunch of snow made them jump. Hours later, they finally reached their car. As they loaded their gear, David glanced back at the trail. He thought he saw a figure standing among the trees, tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. But when he blinked, it was gone. The drive back to the city was silent. None of them spoke about what had happened, as if saying it out loud would make it real. But David knew he wouldn't forget the sound of those footsteps, or the feeling that something had been watching them from the darkness. Months later, when he looked back at the photos from that trip, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In one of the shots of the campfire, just beyond the edge of the light, was a pair of glowing eyes.
Story number 3.
The wind cut sharply through the trees, its icy breath a constant reminder of the bitter cold. Scott tightened his scarf and adjusted the straps of his heavy pack. He wasn't new to winter camping, but this trip had been different from the start. It wasn't just the biting cold or the isolation. It was the strange, uneasy feeling that had settled over him the moment he stepped into this forest. "This place feels off," Mia said from behind him, her voice muffled by the thick wool scarf wrapped around her face. She was struggling to keep pace, her snowshoes crunching over the packed trail. Scott glanced over his shoulder. "You're just not used to winter camping. It always feels quiet, even eerie. It's part of the charm." Mia shot him a look, but said nothing. She'd agreed to the trip reluctantly after much cajoling. Scott, an avid outdoorsman, had assured her that a weekend in the woods would be peaceful and rejuvenating. Now, trudging through a dense forest blanketed in snow and silence, she was already regretting it. The campsite was a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. Scott dropped his pack with a grunt and surveyed the area. The late afternoon light was fading fast and the temperature was plummeting. "This will do," he said. "Let's set up before it gets too dark." Mia nodded, though her gaze kept flicking to the shadows between the trees. There was something about the forest, something heavy, oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. They worked quickly, pitching the tent and gathering firewood. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, the campfire was crackling, casting flickering orange light across the snow. Scott sat close to the flames, warming his hands while Mia stared into the darkness beyond the circle of light. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. Scott paused, listening. The forest was silent, save for the occasional pop of the fire and the distant whisper of the wind. "Hear what?" "I don't know. It sounded like footsteps." Scott chuckled. "It's just the snow settling. It happens when the temperature drops. Relax." Mia nodded, but her grip tightened around the steaming mug of tea in her hands. She hadn't imagined it. There had been a faint, rhythmic crunching sound, like someone or something walking through the snow. She decided not to press the issue. Scott wouldn't take her seriously, and she didn't want to come across as paranoid. As the night deepened, the cold grew more intense. They retreated to the tent, zipping themselves into their sleeping bags. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Scott was asleep almost immediately, his soft snores filling the tent. But Mia lay awake, her mind racing. The wind seemed to carry faint voices, whispers that rose and fell, just at the edge of hearing. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the wind. But then she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. Her heart pounded. "Scott," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Scott, wake up." He groaned and rolled over, groggy. "What is it? Someone's outside." Scott sat up, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just an animal." "No," Mia insisted. "It's not. Listen." They both froze, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was the wind rattling the tent. Scott sighed. "There's nothing out there, Mia. Go back to sleep." But Mia couldn't. She lay stiffly in her sleeping bag, her eyes fixed on the tent's nylon ceiling. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Time seemed to stretch in the dark, cold stillness. And then, just as she was beginning to drift off, something scratched against the side of the tent. Mia shot upright, stifling a gasp. "Scott!" Scott bolted upright too, fumbling for the flashlight. He unzipped the tent flap and shone the beam into the darkness. The light revealed only snow and trees, their shadows stretching long and jagged under the moonlight. "There's nothing here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mia pointed to the tent wall. "Something scratched it. I heard it." Scott stepped out into the snow, scanning the area with the flashlight. The cold bit at his exposed face, but he ignored it, his senses on high alert. He circled the tent, his boots crunching loudly, but found nothing. No tracks, no sign of any animal. He returned to the tent, zipping it up tightly behind him. "There's nothing out there," he said, though his expression was tense. Maybe it was just a branch blowing in the wind. Mia didn't argue, but she didn't believe him either. She spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to the forest. The morning brought a thin gray light and a fresh layer of snow. Scott emerged from the tent first, stretching and yawning. "See?" he said. "We survived the night." Mia stepped out after him, squinting against the glare of the snow. She turned to look at the side of the tent and froze. There, etched into the fabric, were 3 long, deep scratches. "Scott," she said, her voice trembling. "Look." He frowned, walking over to inspect the marks. "That doesn't make sense. I didn't see any tracks last night." Mia's unease deepened. "I told you something was out there." Scott shrugged it off, though he couldn't hide the doubt creeping into his mind. Maybe it was an animal after all. Let's just pack up and explore a bit. We came all this way, we might as well enjoy it. Reluctantly, Mia agreed. They spent the day hiking through the forest, following the frozen stream that wound its way through the trees. The landscape was breathtaking, the silence almost sacred. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she'd see something, or someone, following them. By the time they returned to the campsite, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The tent was just as they'd left it, but the firewood they'd stacked was scattered, as if something or someone had rifled through it. Scott frowned. "Maybe an animal got into it." Mia shook her head. "No animal did this." "Scott, we should leave. Now." Scott hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but he was starting to feel it too. That oppressive, unshakable sense of being watched. "Let's eat something first," he said. "We'll pack up after." They built a small fire and cooked a quick meal, eating in tense silence. The shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker. Just as they were finishing, the sound came again. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, crunching through the snow. Mia's hand tightened around her fork. "Scott?" "I hear it," he said, his voice low. He grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. For a moment they saw nothing, and then just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was a figure, small and pale, standing motionless among the trees. Its features were indistinct, almost blurred, as if it were out of focus, and yet its presence was undeniable. "Who's there?" Scott called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "We need to go," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Scott nodded. They scrambled to pack their things, their movements frantic. The figure didn't approach, but it didn't disappear either. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, its pale form barely visible in the dim light. As they strapped on their packs, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, chilling sound. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched, and childlike. "Go," Scott said, grabbing Mia's arm. "Now." They plunged into the forest, their footsteps pounding against the snow. The laughter followed them, growing louder, more distorted. It echoed through the trees, surrounding them. Mia glanced back once and immediately regretted it. The pale figure was following, gliding soundlessly over the snow. Its face was clearer now, gaunt and hollow, with dark, empty eyes that seemed to swallow the light. "Don't look back," Scott shouted, pulling her forward. The forest seemed to twist and warp around them, the trees closing in. The trail they'd followed earlier was gone, replaced by endless snow and shadows. The laughter was all around them now, mingling with whispers that spoke in a language neither of them understood. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. They stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath. The forest was silent again, but the oppressive feeling remained. Scott shone the flashlight around, his hands shaking. "We're lost," Mia said, her voice breaking. "We're lost, and it's still out there." Scott didn't respond. He was staring at something in the snow, a single set of footprints, leading away from the clearing. The prints were small, like a child's, but they didn't sink into the snow. They hovered just above the surface, untouched. "We need to keep moving," Scott said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mia shook her head. "No, we stay here. We wait for daylight." Scott opened his mouth to argue, but a sound stopped him, a soft, wet thud. He turned the flashlight toward the sound, and his stomach dropped. There in the snow was a single severed hand, small, pale, and perfectly intact. It was pointing at them. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. They ran, blind and desperate, into the night. Neither of them ever spoke of what happened after that. They were found 2 days later by a search and rescue team, half frozen and incoherent. The campsite was never located, and the forest seemed to swallow any trace of their presence. Locals still whisper about the woods in winter, warning travelers to stay away. They speak of the pale figure and the laughter that echoes through the trees, a haunting reminder that some places are better left untouched. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had always been the type of person who loved the quiet of winter. There's something about the stillness of a snow-covered landscape that feels both peaceful and intense. That's why when my friend Jake invited me to go winter camping in the mountains, I was eager to join. I'd been on a handful of summer camping trips, but winter was a different animal, and I liked the idea of pushing my limits. Jake had been camping for years. He knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. We'd planned the trip for months, choosing a remote spot in a national forest about 3 hours outside the city. We were going to hike in, set up camp by a frozen lake, and spend a weekend away from everything. Just the two of us. The trees, the snow, and the cold. The drive up was picturesque, with snow-laden branches bending low and the landscape turning more barren as we climbed higher into the mountains. It was early evening when we arrived, and the sun had already begun to set. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and we still had a short hike ahead of us. "You sure we're not too late to make it to the campsite before dark?" I asked, adjusting my backpack as we began walking along the trail. "We'll make it. Just keep up," Jake replied, grinning. He was always confident when it came to the outdoors. The hike was more difficult than I had anticipated, with the snow making the trail slippery and uneven. But we made steady progress, the darkening sky creating an eerie atmosphere around us. The trees seemed to close in as we moved deeper into the forest. There was a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as though the whole world was holding its breath. By the time we reached the lake, the last light of day had faded completely. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the frozen surface. We set up camp quickly, both of us too focused on the task at hand to pay much attention to the strange quiet of the forest around us. After dinner, we sat by the fire, drinking hot cocoa and talking about old times. The fire crackled and the wind rustled through the trees, but otherwise there was no sound. No animals, no distant calls from birds, not even the occasional howl of a coyote, just the quiet. "Ever notice how the forest is different in the winter?" I asked, staring into the flames. Jake nodded. "Yeah, everything's quieter. It's like the world shuts down for a while." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the fire the only light in the otherwise pitch-black landscape. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft crunching of snow. It was coming from the trees just beyond the clearing. I looked at Jake, but he was still staring into the fire. I didn't want to disturb him, so I kept quiet. But the sound came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened. It wasn't the wind or an animal, this was something else. The crunch of footsteps in the snow, deliberate and slow. "Jake," I said, my voice low but urgent. He looked up, his expression puzzled. "What?" "I think someone's out there," I whispered. Jake glanced around, his eyes narrowing. He stood up and grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the trees. "There's nobody out there, man. It's probably a deer or something." But I wasn't convinced. The sound hadn't been random, and it felt intentional. I stared into the darkness, straining my ears, but the crunching had stopped. All I could hear now was the wind. "Let's just go to bed," Jake said, sitting back down. "You're just spooked. Happens to everyone out here." I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed, but I didn't argue. We doused the fire and crawled into our tents. The cold crept in almost immediately, and I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me, trying to block out the creeping sense of unease that was slowly taking hold. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. This time, it was louder, unmistakable, footsteps, and they were close, too close. I sat up, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shone the beam toward the source of the sound. Nothing. There was no one there. The snow was undisturbed, save for the faint outlines of our footprints from earlier. I turned back to my tent, and that's when I saw it. The dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned clothing, a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, though I couldn't make out any details in the dim light. The shape was just wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body was frozen in place as the figure remained motionless, staring at me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I rushed to Jake's tent, shaking him awake. "Jake, wake up!" I said, my voice frantic. Jake groggily sat up. What's going on? I saw something. Someone's out there. Jake rubbed his eyes, clearly not taking me seriously. There's no one out there, man. You're just freaking yourself out. I'm not making this up, Jake, I insisted. I saw someone. They were standing by the trees, watching us. Jake sighed and crawled out of his tent. Okay, let's go check it out. We both stood at the edge of the clearing, shining our flashlights into the trees. The air was still, and the only sound was the soft crunch of snow beneath our feet as we moved slowly toward the tree line. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of anyone. I told you, Jake said, shaking his head. It was probably just an animal or your imagination. Let's get some sleep. I was about to argue, but then I noticed something. Just ahead of us, in the snow, were more footprints, but they were strange, small, barely visible, as though someone or something had walked through the snow without boots or shoes, leaving barely an imprint. The footprints led toward the trees, and I could see that they stopped right at the edge of the clearing. The blood drained from my face. Jake, those weren't there earlier. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at the prints, his expression grim. Finally, he spoke. This isn't good. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt it then, that overwhelming sense of being watched. I turned, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing, just the silent, endless woods. Let's pack up and leave, I said, my voice shaking. Jake didn't argue. We quickly gathered our things and started down the trail, our footsteps crunching loudly in the snow. But no matter how fast we walked, the feeling of being followed never left. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the shadows, watching us. When we finally reached the trailhead and saw the parked car in the distance, I felt a weight lift off my chest. We didn't speak as we loaded our gear into the car and slammed the doors shut. The forest seemed to press in on us as we drove away, the dark silhouette of the trees barely visible in the rearview mirror. The silence in the car was deafening. Neither of us spoke about what happened that night. We never camped in the winter again. But every now and then, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows stretch long across the snow, I still feel like someone is watching me. And I wonder if we were ever alone in that forest. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The first snow of winter blanketed the forest as James, Allison, and Marcus trudged through the knee-high drifts, their packs heavy with gear. They had been planning this winter camping trip for months, eager to experience the remote beauty of the Rockies in its quiet, frozen state. The idea was James's, an experienced outdoorsman who loved the challenge of winter trekking. Allison, his girlfriend, was less confident but eager to prove herself. And Marcus, their friend, tagged along, drawn by the thrill of adventure. They'd picked a spot deep in the wilderness, far from trails and other campers. The snow-covered peaks and icy rivers promised a pristine escape from civilization. By the time they reached their chosen campsite, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting long, cold shadows across the clearing. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the forest seemed to settle into an eerie stillness. They pitched their tents and started a fire, the flickering flames their only source of warmth and light in the growing darkness. As they ate their freeze-dried meals, Marcus started telling ghost stories. You know, he said, his voice low, this area is supposed to be haunted. They say a group of miners disappeared here back in the late 1800s. No one knows what happened to them, just that they went into the woods and never came back. People who camp here say they hear strange noises like voices calling from the trees. Great, Allison muttered, pulling her coat tighter around her. That's just what I needed to hear. James laughed. Come on, it's just a story. There's no such thing as ghosts. But as the wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead, Allison couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness beyond the firelight. That night, as the three of them settled into their tents, the cold seeped into every crevice, making sleep difficult. Allison lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a faint whisper so soft she thought she might have imagined it. Allison? Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She held her breath, straining to hear over the wind. There it was again, clearer this time. Allison. She unzipped her sleeping bag and peeked out of the tent. The campsite was quiet, the fire reduced to glowing embers. She saw no movement, but the whisper came again, seeming to come from the forest. Allison, terrified, she crawled out of the tent and hurried to James's. "James, wake up," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned and rolled over. "What is it?" "I heard something," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's out there." James sighed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "It's probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." But when they heard the whisper again, his expression changed. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the tree line. "Marcus?" he called, his breath visible in the cold air. No answer. James walked to Marcus's tent and unzipped it. "Hey, did you hear that?" Marcus sat up, his face pale. "I thought it was one of you messing around," he said. "I heard my name, too." The three of them stood together in the clearing, had their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The forest was silent now, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. "Let's just get through the night," James said. "We'll pack up and leave first thing in the morning." Reluctantly, they returned to their tents, though none of them expected to sleep. Allison lay awake, her every nerve on edge, listening for the whisper. Hours passed, and just when she started to relax, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. She bolted upright, her heart hammering. "James! Marcus!" The two men emerged from their tents, wide-eyed and holding flashlights. "What the hell was that?" Marcus asked. Before anyone could answer, the scream came again, echoing through the trees. It was inhuman, a chilling mix of anguish and rage. The sound sent shivers down their spines. "That's not an animal," James said, his voice unsteady. "We need to leave, now." They hurriedly packed their gear, fumbling with frozen fingers. The screaming continued, growing closer and more frantic. By the time they were ready to go, the forest felt alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees. As they started down the trail, their flashlights barely illuminating the way, Allison froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. In the distance, a figure stood motionless in the snow. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. James aimed his flashlight at it, but the beam seemed to pass right through as if it wasn't really there. Then, without warning, the figure vanished. "Run," James said, his voice tight with fear. "Don't stop. Just run." They took off, their breaths ragged, their boots slipping on the icy ground. The forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows pressing closer. The screams followed them, echoing from every direction, and the whispering voices returned, calling their names. Allison, James, Marcus. Allison's legs burned, but she didn't dare slow down. She glanced back and saw the figure again, closer this time, its shape distorted and unnatural. Its hollow eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. By the time they reached the trailhead and saw James's truck, they were nearly in tears. They threw their gear into the back and climbed in, slamming the doors behind them. James started the engine, and they sped down the snowy road, leaving the haunted forest behind. For the first few miles, no one spoke. Then Marcus broke the silence. "What was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What did we just see?" James shook his head. "I don't know, but we're never coming back here." Allison stared out the window, her hands still shaking. She could have sworn she saw the figure standing among the trees as they drove away, watching them leave. Even now, months later, she can still hear the whispers when she closes her eyes, and she knows, deep down, that whatever they encountered that night is still out there, waiting for its next visitors.
Story number 6.
The snow crunched underfoot as Mark adjusted the straps of his backpack and took another deep breath of the icy mountain air. The forest around him was serene, a stark white blanket of snow draped over every tree and branch, muffling the world to a near-silent calm. This was exactly what he'd needed, a weekend escape from the noise of the city. Winter camping, he'd thought, was the perfect antidote for stress. Beside him, his longtime friend Dave trudged through the knee-deep snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You sure this is the right trail?" Dave asked, glancing at the map in Mark's gloved hand. Mark nodded. "Yeah, the ranger said it's about 3 miles up to a clearing by the lake. Perfect spot to set up camp." Dave grumbled something about getting frostbite, but didn't argue. He wasn't thrilled about spending 2 nights in sub-zero temperatures, but Mark had convinced him with promises of pristine views, quiet solitude, and an adventure they'd laugh about later. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was already low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The lake, frozen solid, shimmered faintly in the dying light. It was breathtaking. "This'll do," Mark said, dropping his pack and stretching. "Let's set up before it gets dark." They worked quickly, pitching their tents and building a small fire. The temperature was dropping fast, and the stillness of the forest was almost oppressive. By the time they sat down to eat, the stars had appeared, scattered like diamonds across the black sky. "This isn't so bad," Dave admitted, sipping hot soup from a tin mug, kinda peaceful. Mark smiled, satisfied. "Told you, just us and nature." But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, that sense of peace began to waver. The forest, so silent during the day, now seemed alive with faint, untraceable sounds. Twigs snapping, a distant rustle, the creak of tree branches swaying in the windless night. "You hear that?" Dave asked, his voice low. Mark nodded slowly. "Probably just animals. Deer, maybe." Dave didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. They banked the fire and retreated to their tents, zipping themselves into their sleeping bags to fend off the biting cold. Mark drifted off quickly, lulled by the fatigue of the hike and the warmth of his down sleeping bag. But sometime in the middle of the night he woke up. At first, he wasn't sure why. The tent was dark and the forest was silent. Too silent. Then he heard it. Crunch. 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 The sound of footsteps on snow, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to listen, hoping it was just his imagination, but the sound continued, steady and unhurried. Someone, or something, was walking outside. "Dave," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. Mark unzipped his sleeping bag as quietly as he could and reached for his flashlight. He considered calling out, but a deep, primal fear held him back. Instead, he clicked the flashlight on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light swept across the clearing, illuminating the snow and the dark silhouettes of trees. Nothing moved. The fire was nothing but glowing embers now, casting faint shadows. But the footsteps, they had stopped. Mark's breath fogged in the cold air as he scanned the clearing, his pulse racing. He was about to zip the tent back up when he saw them. Tracks. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest and circling the tents. They were human, barefoot, as if someone had walked through the snow without shoes. Mark's stomach twisted. Who would be out here, miles from civilization, barefoot in the snow? "Dave," he whispered again, louder this time. Dave groaned from his tent. "What? Come out here. Now." A moment later, Dave unzipped his tent, rubbing his eyes. "What's your problem, man?" Mark pointed at the tracks. "Look." Dave's tired expression turned to one of confusion and then fear. "What the hell? Are those—" "Yeah," Mark said. "Someone's out here." Dave scanned the forest, his breath quickening. "Where are they now?" Mark shook his head. "Some Greek. I don't know. They were walking around the tents a minute ago." Dave swore under his breath and grabbed a hatchet from his pack. "We should pack up and leave." "In the middle of the night?" Mark asked. "We'd get lost. Let's wait until morning." Reluctantly, Dave agreed, but neither of them went back to sleep. They sat by the dying embers of the fire, their backs to each other, watching the darkness. Hours passed, but nothing else happened. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The tracks were still there, more visible now in the morning light. They led into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Mark and Dave packed up camp as quickly as they could, both of them too unnerved to stick around. "Let's just get back to the car," Dave said, his voice tight. Mark agreed, and they started down the trail. But the sense of unease only grew as they walked. The forest felt different now, the trees seeming taller, darker, and more imposing. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. After about an hour, they reached a fork in the trail. Mark pulled out the map, frowning. "This wasn't here on the way up." Dave looked around, his expression tense. "You're sure we're on the same trail?" Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, but this doesn't make sense." They chose the left path, hoping it would lead them back to the parking lot. But the further they walked, the more unfamiliar the forest became. The trees grew denser, the trail narrower, until it seemed to disappear altogether. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. The sun was high now, but its light felt dim, muted by the heavy clouds rolling in. The forest was silent again, save for the crunch of their boots on the snow. Then they heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, distant but unmistakable, a high-pitched, childlike giggle that echoed through the trees. Dave stopped in his tracks, his face pale. "Tell me you heard that." Mark nodded, his throat dry. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by a soft melodic humming. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" The forest answered with silence. They picked up their pace, desperation driving them forward. But no matter how far they walked, the trail didn't reappear. The laughter and humming followed them, always just out of sight. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was a single wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney and a faint light glowed in the window. "Thank God," Dave said, hurrying toward the cabin. "Maybe they can help us." But Mark hesitated. Something about the cabin felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still, as if it didn't belong there. "Wait," he said, grabbing Dave's arm. "We don't know who." The door creaked open before he could finish. A woman stepped out, her face obscured by the shadow of the doorway. She was barefoot, her pale feet sinking into the snow. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice soft and sweet. Dave nodded, relief washing over his face. "Yes, thank you. Can you help us find the trail?" The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Come inside. You must be cold." Mark's gut twisted. "No, we're fine. We just need directions." The woman stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the snow. Her smile widened unnaturally, stretching her lips too far. "Come inside," she said again, her voice echoing strangely. Mark grabbed Dave's arm. "We need to go. Now." Dave hesitated, but the look in Mark's eyes convinced him. They turned and ran, the woman's laughter ringing out behind them, high and piercing. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees blurring together as they sprinted blindly through the snow. When they finally burst onto the road, their legs burning and their lungs heaving, they didn't stop. They ran until they saw Mark's car, parked exactly where they'd left it. They never spoke of what happened in the forest. Not to each other, not to anyone. But Mark knew they hadn't been alone out there, and he knew deep down that the forest wasn't done with them. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it sharp flakes of snow that bit into Kevin's cheeks. He tightened the hood of his parka and looked back at his friends, Emily and Josh, who were struggling up the incline behind him. Their gear-laden packs swayed with each step, and their breaths billowed in frosty clouds. "We should set up camp soon," Kevin called over the wind. The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows across the white landscape. Josh grunted. "Yeah, good idea. My legs are about to give out." Emily stopped to catch her breath, leaning on her trekking poles. "I don't know why we thought winter camping was a good idea. This place feels like it hasn't seen a human being in decades." Kevin chuckled. "That's the point. No crowds, no noise, just us in the wilderness. It's perfect." But Emily didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line, where the fading light painted the snow a dull gray. Kevin followed her gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the skeletal outlines of trees swaying in the wind. "What is it?" he asked. Emily shook her head, blinking as if snapping herself out of a trance. "Nothing. Let's just get camp set up." They found a small clearing near a frozen creek and worked quickly to pitch their tents and build a fire. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the darkening sky pressed down like a heavy blanket. By the time they sat around the fire to eat their freeze-dried meals, the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. Kevin poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "This is what it's all about, guys. Peace and quiet. Just us and nature." Josh took a sip of hot cocoa and smirked. "And frostbite. Don't forget frostbite." Emily wasn't laughing. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease growing with every passing minute. "Doesn't it feel too quiet?" she asked finally. "Like no animals, no wind, nothing?" Kevin shrugged. "It's winter. A lot of animals hibernate, and the snow dampens sound. You're just not used to it." Emily stared into the flames, but her jaw was tight. "Maybe." They stayed up a little longer, talking and laughing to chase away the cold. Eventually, the fire dwindled, and they retreated to their tents. The wind had died down, leaving the world eerily still. Kevin crawled into his sleeping bag, sighing with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of adventure he'd wanted. But sometime in the middle of the night, he woke up. At first, he wasn't sure what had disturbed him. The tent was pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the fabric. He lay still, listening. The silence was suffocating. Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound. Footsteps in the snow. Kevin's heart began to race. He turned his head toward the tent flap, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. He thought about calling out, but something stopped him. A deep, primal fear told him not to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded into the distance. Kevin lay awake for the rest of the night, every creak and rustle sending jolts of fear through his body. He told himself it was just an animal, but the measured cadence of the steps didn't match anything he'd ever heard in the wild. When dawn finally broke, Kevin stumbled out of his tent, bleary-eyed and jittery. Emily and Josh were already up, their faces pale and drawn. "Did you guys hear that?" Kevin asked. Josh nodded grimly. "Yeah, I thought it was just me. It sounded like someone walking around." Emily hugged herself, her breath coming out in shaky puffs. "I didn't sleep at all. There's something wrong with this place." Kevin scanned the campsite. The snow was smooth and untouched. No tracks, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. His stomach churned. "Let's pack up and move," he said. "We'll find another spot." They didn't argue. Within an hour, they were back on the trail, trudging deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around them, their dark branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. By late afternoon, they found another clearing and set up camp again. The mood was tense, but no one spoke of the footsteps. They built a fire and huddled close, their voices subdued. As night fell, the unease returned. The fire's light only seemed to deepen the shadows, and the forest was so quiet it felt alive with its own presence. They climbed into their tents early, too on edge to linger outside. Kevin lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling. He didn't think he'd sleep, but exhaustion eventually overtook him. He wasn't sure how long he'd been out when the sound woke him again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were back, closer this time. They moved slowly, deliberately, circling his tent. Kevin's breath caught in his throat. He clutched his flashlight but didn't dare turn it on. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was a long, heavy silence. And then, something brushed against the side of the tent. Kevin bolted upright, his heart hammering. He fumbled with the zipper, adrenaline overriding his fear. He burst out into the cold night, flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing but snow and trees. "Josh! Emily!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Their tent flaps unzipped and they emerged, their faces pale and frightened. "What's going on?" Josh demanded. "Something's out here," Kevin said, his voice shaking. "It touched my tent." Josh swore under his breath, and Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you there's something wrong with this place." Kevin swept the flashlight across the snow, but there were no tracks, no sign of movement. The three of them huddled together, their breath fogging in the freezing air. The forest seemed to close in around them, the silence heavier than ever. And then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the woods, they heard it. A laugh. High-pitched and childlike, it sent a chill down Kevin's spine. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound human. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Now." Kevin nodded. "Grab your stuff. We're going." They packed in a frenzy, their hands shaking with fear. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the trees until it seemed to come from all around them. As they strapped on their packs and started down the trail, the sound followed, always just out of sight. The forest seemed to shift and twist as they moved, the trees looming closer, their branches forming an oppressive canopy. The laughter was joined by whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that rose and fell like the wind. "Keep moving," Kevin urged, though his legs felt like lead. "Don't stop." But the trail was gone. The landmarks they'd used to navigate earlier had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of snow and shadow. Panic set in as they realized they were hopelessly lost. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The three of them froze, their breath hitching in their throats. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Kevin saw it. A figure, pale and thin, standing motionless among the trees. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was blank, featureless, yet somehow Kevin felt its gaze boring into him. "Run!" he screamed. They bolted, adrenaline propelling them forward. The figure didn't chase them, but its presence seemed to stretch, following them wherever they went. The forest closed in tighter, the air growing colder with every step. Emily stumbled, falling to her knees. Kevin and Josh pulled her up, but her face was pale, her lips blue. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Kevin shouted. "We're getting out of here." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. The forest felt endless, its twisted paths leading nowhere. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep into his very bones. And then, just as they were about to collapse from exhaustion, the trees thinned, and they stumbled into a clearing. Ahead of them was a road, barely visible under the snow. A miracle. They staggered onto the road, their breaths ragged. The forest behind them was silent, but Kevin didn't dare look back. They kept walking until they saw headlights in the distance. A lone truck. Its driver a grizzled old man who took one look at them and knew something was wrong. "You kids shouldn't be out here," he said as he helped them into the cab. "This place, it's not safe." Kevin didn't ask what he meant. He didn't want to know. They never spoke of what happened in the forest, not to each other or anyone else. But Kevin knew he would never forget the laughter, the whispers, or the pale figure watching from the trees. Somewhere out there in the frozen wilderness, it was still waiting.
Story number 8.
The snow fell in thick, soft flakes, blanketing the forest in an eerie silence. Samantha adjusted her scarf and tightened her grip on her hiking poles. The cold stung her cheeks, but the beauty of the scene around her made it worth it. Winter camping was her escape, a break from the monotonous grind of her office job. She always felt at home in the wilderness, even in the biting chill of January. Behind her, her boyfriend Eric trudged along, his breath visible in the icy air. "Are we close?" he called, his voice muffled by his scarf. Samantha checked her GPS. "A little further. There's supposed to be a clearing near the ridge where we can set up camp." Eric muttered something under his breath, probably cursing her idea to go camping in the dead of winter. But he'd agreed, knowing how much she loved it, and Samantha appreciated that. They had spent most of the morning hiking through dense woods, the trail barely visible under a fresh layer of snow. It had been hours since they'd seen another person. When they finally reached the clearing, the view took their breath away. The valley below was a sea of white, the treetops dusted with snow, and beyond it all, the jagged peaks of the mountains rose against the pale gray sky. Samantha smiled. "This is perfect." Eric dropped his pack and groaned. "Perfectly freezing. Let's get the tents up before I turn into an icicle." They worked quickly, pitching their tents side by side and building a small fire. The warmth was a welcome relief as they sat down to eat their dinner, the glow of the flames casting long shadows across the snow. Darkness came quickly in the winter, and soon the forest around them was pitch black. "This isn't so bad," Eric admitted, sipping from his thermos of hot cocoa. "Kinda peaceful." Samantha nodded. "Exactly. Just us and nature." But as the night deepened, the sense of peace began to wane. The fire crackled softly, but the woods around them were silent. Too silent. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "You hear that?" Eric asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Samantha looked up. "Hear what?" Eric tilted his head, listening. "I thought I heard, I don't know, like footsteps." She strained her ears but heard nothing. "Probably just the snow settling," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Eric didn't look convinced, but he shrugged it off. They stayed by the fire a little longer before retreating to their tents. Samantha crawled into her sleeping bag, her body aching from the hike. The wind had picked up, whistling softly through the trees, and she closed her eyes, letting the sound lull her to sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, she woke up. At first, she wasn't sure what had disturbed her. She lay still, listening. The wind had stopped, and the silence was oppressive. Then she heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. Samantha's heart began to race. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the tents. She thought about calling out to Eric, but something told her to stay quiet. The sound stopped, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, from somewhere nearby, she heard a faint whisper. It was too soft to make out the words, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Eric," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. She unzipped her sleeping bag and reached for her flashlight, her hands trembling. Slowly, she unzipped the tent flap and shone the light outside. The beam illuminated the snow, untouched and pristine, except for a single set of footprints leading away from the campsite. They were human footprints, barefoot, and they disappeared into the woods. Samantha's stomach churned. "Eric!" she hissed louder. A moment later, his tent unzipped and his groggy face appeared. "What? What's wrong?" "Look," she said, pointing at the footprints. Eric's eyes widened as he stepped out of his tent, his boots crunching in the snow. "What the hell? Who would be out here without shoes?" "I don't know," Samantha whispered, "but they were walking around our tents." Eric grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the forest, but the trees revealed nothing. The footprints vanished into the darkness. "We should leave," he said, his voice tight. "This doesn't feel right." Samantha nodded, but it was the middle of the night, and navigating the trail in the dark was dangerous. Reluctantly, they decided to wait until morning. They stoked the fire and sat by it, their backs to each other, watching the woods. The hours dragged on, but nothing else happened. By the time the first light of dawn broke, Samantha's nerves were raw, and her body ached from tension. The footprints were still there, like stark against the fresh snow. They packed up their gear quickly, eager to leave the clearing. The trail back to the parking lot felt longer than Samantha remembered. The trees loomed over them, their bare branches forming a canopy that blocked out the weak sunlight. The air felt heavy, and every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of their boots, the rustle of their jackets, the occasional snap of a branch. About an hour into the hike, they reached a fork in the trail. Samantha stopped, frowning. This wasn't here before. Eric looked around, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure we're on the right path?" She checked the GPS, but the signal was weak and the map wouldn't load. "I think so," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. They chose the left path, hoping it would lead them back. But the further they walked, the less familiar the forest became. The trail narrowed, the snow grew deeper, and soon it felt like they were walking in circles. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. The sun was already low on the horizon, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and dark across the snow. Samantha's chest tightened as she tried to suppress her rising fear. Then they heard it, a laugh. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. A high, childlike giggle that seemed to echo through the trees. Eric froze, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Samantha nodded, her heart pounding. The laugh came again, louder this time, followed by a soft, melodic humming. It sounded like a lullaby, the notes drifting through the forest on an unseen breeze. "Hello?" Samantha called out, her voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The forest answered with silence. Eric grabbed her arm. "We need to keep moving." They quickened their pace, their breath coming in ragged bursts. The laughter and humming followed them, always just out of sight. The trees seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with every step. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing. In the center stood a wooden cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney and a faint light glowed in the window. Eric hesitated. "Do you think?" Before he could finish, the cabin door creaked open. A woman stepped out, her face pale and gaunt, her hair falling in limp strands around her shoulders. She wore a tattered dress and her feet were bare, leaving no prints in the snow. "You look lost," she said, her voice soft and lilting. Samantha's blood ran cold. The woman's eyes were too dark, almost black, and her smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. Samantha took a step back, pulling Eric with her. "We're fine," Samantha said quickly, "just looking for the trail." The woman's smile widened. "Come inside, it's warm." Eric started to move toward the cabin, but Samantha tightened her grip on his arm. "No," she whispered. "Don't." The woman's expression didn't change, but the air around them seemed to grow colder. The humming began again, faint but insistent, and Samantha realized it was coming from the woman. "Run," she whispered to Eric. They turned and bolted back into the woods, the sound of the woman's laughter chasing after them. The trees blurred together as they ran, their lungs burning from the effort. Samantha didn't dare look back. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the parking lot ahead, relief flooded her body. They didn't stop until they reached the car, throwing their packs in the trunk and climbing inside. As they drove away, Samantha glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she thought she saw the woman standing at the edge of the forest. her black eyes glinting in the fading light. But when she looked again, there was nothing but trees. They never spoke of what happened on that trip. But Samantha knew she would never forget the laughter, the humming, or the woman with the too wide smile. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The wind howled through the pines, carrying with it a biting chill that sliced through the thickest layers of clothing. Mason, Sarah, and Will trudged along the snow-packed trail, their breath visible in the frigid air. The three friends had been planning this winter camping trip for months, eager to escape the monotony of daily life and challenge themselves in the wilderness. The snow-covered mountains of Vermont seemed like the perfect backdrop for their adventure. Their destination was an old logging site deep in the forest, a place Mason had read about in an obscure camping forum. The post had described it as a beautiful, secluded spot, but there had been an ominous footnote. Camp there if you want, but locals avoid it for a reason. Strange things happen in those woods, especially in winter. Mason hadn't mentioned that part to Sarah or Will. The trail had been difficult, and the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees by the time they reached the clearing. The site was picturesque, with towering evergreens surrounding an open space dusted in soft, untouched snow. A crumbling stone chimney stood near the edge of the clearing, the only remnant of a long-gone cabin. "This is perfect," Mason said, dropping his pack and stretching his arms. "Told you it'd be worth it." "It's freezing," Sarah muttered, blowing on her gloved hands. She glanced at the chimney, her brow furrowing. "That thing's creepy, though. It looks like it's watching us." Will chuckled, but his laughter was uneasy. "Relax, Sarah. It's just a chimney. It's probably older than all of us combined." They set up camp quickly, the temperature plummeting as darkness fell. Mason got a fire going, and the three of them huddled around it, sipping hot coffee from thermoses. The conversation drifted from their favorite hikes to urban legends and ghost stories, as it often did on their trips. Mason brought up the story of the logging camp, how workers had supposedly vanished there one winter without a trace, leaving only their tools and half-eaten meals behind. "Great," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Now I'll definitely sleep well." "It's just a story," Mason said, though even he felt a twinge of unease as he glanced toward the chimney. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance across the stone. They called it a night not long after, retreating to their tents to escape the cold. Mason lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the wind whip through the trees. The fire outside had dwindled to embers, and the clearing was cloaked in darkness. Just as he was beginning to doze off, he heard it, a faint sound, almost drowned out by the wind. It was distant at first, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on snow. He sat up, his pulse quickening. "Will? Sarah?" he called softly. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mason's breath caught as he saw a shadow pass by his tent, just a quick flicker against the thin nylon. His first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but the footsteps were deliberate, measured, human. Summoning his courage, he unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. The chimney loomed in the background, its jagged edges casting strange shadows. Mason's eyes scanned the trees, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. He crawled back into his tent, telling himself it was nothing. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the campsite, slow and deliberate, the sound almost hypnotic. Mason lay awake for hours, clutching his flashlight and waiting for dawn. In the morning, Mason wasn't the only one who looked worse for wear. Sarah had dark circles under her eyes, and Will's usually carefree demeanor was strained. "Did either of you hear footsteps last night?" Mason asked as they packed up their gear. Sarah froze. "I thought I was imagining it. They were circling my tent." Will nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard them too, and I swear I heard someone whispering my name." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "We should go," he said. "Now." They broke camp quickly and started back down the trail. The snow was deeper than it had been the day before, and the trail markers were harder to spot. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the trees. Hours passed, and the sense of unease only grew. The forest felt darker, the shadows deeper. The three of them barely spoke, their focus on finding their way back. But no matter how far they walked, the scenery didn't change. The trees looked the same, and the trail seemed to loop back on itself. "We've been here before," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. She pointed to a broken branch lying in the snow. "I marked that spot hours ago." "That's not possible," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. "It's like the woods are messing with us," Will muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "I swear I keep seeing something out there, in the trees." The light began to fade, and with it came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind carrying fragments of words. But as darkness fell, they grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, overlapping and echoing, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Mason tightened his grip on his trekking pole, his heart hammering. "We need to keep moving." But the whispers were everywhere now, surrounding them, filling the air with an almost palpable weight. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, darting between the trees. Mason thought he saw a figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured, standing just beyond the firelight. When he blinked, it was gone. Then came the footsteps again. This time they weren't distant. They were right behind them. "Run!" Mason shouted. They bolted, their boots slipping on the icy trail as they sprinted through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the footsteps followed, relentless and unyielding. Sarah tripped, falling hard into the snow, and Mason and Will pulled her to her feet, their breaths ragged. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a break in the trees. They ran toward it, the forest seeming to push against them, the air thick and heavy. When they finally burst into the clearing, the whispers stopped, and the footsteps faded into silence. They were back at the campsite. "No," Sarah whispered, collapsing to her knees. "This can't be happening." The fire pit was cold, their tracks from the morning still visible in the snow. The chimney loomed above them, more menacing than ever. Mason felt a surge of dread as he realized they were trapped. As night fell again, the clearing came alive with movement. Shadows flickered at the edges, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The three of them huddled by the cold fire pit, too terrified to move. Mason stared at the chimney, his breath shallow. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the darkness, eyes, glowing faintly, watching them. The night stretched on endlessly, and by the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, they were too exhausted to do anything but sit in stunned silence. When they finally found the strength to stand, they left their gear behind and walked. They didn't follow the trail this time. They simply moved in the direction of the rising sun, desperate to escape. Hours later, they stumbled onto a logging road. A passing truck stopped to help, and the driver stared at them with wide eyes. "You're lucky you made it out," he said as he handed them blankets. "People go missing up there all the time." They never spoke of what happened that night, but Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't let them go entirely. Sometimes, as in the dead of winter, he still heard the whispers.
Story number 10.
The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing the dense forest in a suffocating silence. Jason, Emily, and Greg trudged along the barely visible trail, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. The three friends had been planning their winter camping trip for months, craving an escape from the chaos of city life. They had chosen a remote location in northern Maine, far from any towns or cell phone towers, where they could truly disconnect. By the time they reached the clearing Jason had marked on the map, the sun was already setting behind the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. They quickly set up their tents and built a small fire, the flickering flames offering a faint sense of security against the darkness. "This place is beautiful," Emily said, pulling her coat tighter as she stared at the towering evergreens around them. "But it's also, I don't know, kind of eerie?" Greg chuckled as he stirred a pot of instant soup over the fire. "Eerie? It's just the woods, Em. Don't let your imagination run wild." Jason glanced at her and shrugged. "She's not wrong. There's something about winter camping that feels different. The quiet, the isolation, it's like the forest is holding its breath." Emily shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or Jason's words. She decided not to say what was really bothering her, that she felt like they were being watched. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics. They laughed, shared stories, and drank hot cocoa from thermoses. By the time they retreated to their tents, the fire was little more than glowing embers, and the temperature had plummeted. Emily lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon walls of her tent. The wind outside howled like a distant wail, and the branches above creaked under the weight of the snow. She tried to focus on the sound of her breathing, but her thoughts kept returning to that nagging feeling of being watched. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. Somewhere deep in the night, she woke suddenly, her heart pounding. For a moment, she wasn't sure what had roused her. Then she heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps on snow coming from just outside her tent. She held her breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, deliberate and slow, circling the campsite. Emily's pulse quickened. "Jason? Greg?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold. A soft, low whisper, barely distinguishable from the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. Terrified, Emily fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness inside her tent. She wanted to scream for the others, but fear paralyzed her. She stared at the tent zipper, half expecting it to start moving. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. Eventually, the whispers stopped and the forest fell silent once more. Emily didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, she emerged from her tent to find Jason and Greg already awake, their faces pale and drawn. "You look like hell," Greg said, though his usual sarcasm was absent. "I didn't sleep," Emily admitted. "There was something outside my tent last night. Footsteps and whispering." Jason and Greg exchanged a glance. "I heard it too," Jason said quietly. "At first, I thought it was one of you. But when I called out, there was no answer." Greg nodded, his hands trembling as he sipped coffee from a tin mug. "Same here. I thought I was losing my mind." They fell into a tense silence, the cheerful mood of the previous evening replaced by unease. As they ate a quick breakfast, Emily noticed something strange in the snow around their campsite. Tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, long, narrow imprints that seemed to circle the tents. But there were no other trails leading to or from the clearing. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" she asked, pointing them out. Jason knelt to examine them, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it was, it didn't come from the trail. It's like it just appeared here." "Great," Greg muttered. "So we're dealing with ghost animals now?" Jason stood, brushing snow from his gloves. "Let's pack up and head back. We're not that far from the car, and I don't want to stick around to see if it comes back." They quickly dismantled their camp and set off along the trail, their pace brisk despite the deep snow. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on them like silent sentinels. The occasional gust of wind sent showers of snow cascading from the branches, making them jump. After about an hour of hiking, they reached a fork in the trail. Jason stopped, checking the map. "This isn't right," he said, frowning. "We didn't pass a fork on the way in." "Are you sure?" Emily asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I'm sure," Jason said. "But this map says we should keep going left." Greg groaned. "I thought you said you were an expert at this." Jason shot him a glare. "I am, but something's off." Reluctantly, they followed the left path. The snow was deeper here, and the forest seemed even quieter, as if they were the only living things for miles. Emily kept looking behind them, convinced she saw movement in the shadows, though every time she turned there was nothing there. After another hour of hiking, they came to a small clearing. Emily's stomach dropped. "This is our campsite," she said, staring at the familiar rock formations and fire pit. "That's impossible," Jason said. "We've been walking in a straight line." "Apparently not," Greg muttered, his voice tight with fear. Jason checked the map again, muttering under his breath, "Let's try the right path this time." They set off again, their unease growing with every step. The air felt heavier, colder, and the whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable, just at the edge of hearing. "Do you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Neither Jason nor Greg answered, but their tense expressions told her they did. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a pale, eerie light over the snow, they reached another clearing. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was the campsite again. "No," Jason said, shaking his head. "This doesn't make any sense." Greg dropped his pack and sat down in the snow, his face pale. "We're lost. We're going in circles." "We're not lost," Jason said firmly, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "This isn't possible. It's like the forest is playing tricks on us." Emily didn't respond. She was staring at the fire pit, which now contained fresh ashes. Their ashes. It was as if they had never left. The whispers grew louder surrounding them, coming from every direction. The sky darkened rapidly, and the wind picked up, swirling snow around them. Shadows flickered at the edges of the clearing, growing closer. "Get the fire going," Jason said, his voice urgent. "Now." Greg scrambled to light the kindling while Emily huddled close, clutching her arms to stop herself from shaking. The shadows moved closer, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, a tall, thin silhouette with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. The fire roared to life, and the shadows retreated slightly, but the whispers didn't stop. They sat around the flames, clutching each other, as the forest seemed to come alive around them. They didn't sleep that night. By morning, the whispers had stopped, and the forest was still again. Without a word, they packed their things and set off, this time ignoring the trail entirely, and heading in the direction they thought was east. After what felt like hours, they emerged from the forest and stumbled onto the road where Jason's truck was parked. They climbed in, their faces pale and their bodies trembling, and drove away without looking back. None of them spoke about what had happened, but they all knew they would never go camping in the winter, or in those woods again. Whatever had been in the forest that night wasn't something they could explain. And as they drove away, Emily glanced out the window and thought she saw a figure standing at the tree line, watching them leave. Story the end.